Hello. Hello, police. Yeah, what's the problem, sir? We just drove down our farm track. Yeah. Go and feed our pheasants. We come across a Range Rover with 3 people in it. Yeah. It appears that they're dead. I don't know what's happening. Blood in the motor all over them.
And welcome back to a new video on the Essex Boys case. As always, if you are enjoying the content, please do give the video a thumbs up. And if you're interested in the Essex Boys case, or simply true crime in general, don't forget to hit the subscribe button below. Now, before I start this series, it's important for me to mention that the author does not seek to discredit any previous accounts or versions of events leading up to the gruesome murders. He merely offers an interesting alternative scenario to be considered. Now, this story has 2 subplots which merge together. It's important that you stick with part 1, as towards the end of this video, you will begin to see how it all ties together. So let's now start with part 1 of Once Upon a Time in Essex. If upon analysis of the facts and evidence, an intelligent man can eliminate all the possible explanations, then an intelligent man must surmise that which he has yet considered impossible to be the only possible explanation. Most of Britain's career criminals will accept or consider they are plagued by an element of bad luck. But is it bad luck, or something else far more sinister? Most have at one time considered just one deal, one particular deal important to them. On any given day, the deal would have made things different. It would have allowed them to step back a little, maybe even retire, to enjoy the fabled good life that so few ever achieve, and all convey. It's always the one deal, the one that mattered, the one that will change things. This one always goes wrong. It's not the end for them, and it doesn't put them out of business. It doesn't always get them nicked, but it matters, because it's the one they didn't want to fail that always does. Why is it that all these intelligent career criminals can just put it down to bad luck, or the unknown informer, or maybe an undercover guy embedded deeply in their organisation? Bad luck? Or just the police got lucky that day, they tell themselves? None consider. Maybe they just foolishly gave themselves up, when they forgot just how capable the opposition really are. The best move the experts tell us to make in the game of chess is the move your opponent least wants you to make. There are some great chess players out there, and yet they hide in the shadows. These players in the shadows will tell you, if you can get into your opponent's head without him knowing you are there, and know all his secrets, then you'll know the best move to make and always win the game. There is no good life if you're on their radar, the men from the shadows. It's all about what works for the greater good in their great game. If you serve a purpose, you serve them. They will keep you on the board, playing the game for them. When you think you can get out, then they throw you to the wolves. There is no good life, ever. There is something deep within Britain. It is the reason it was once Great Britain. As time goes by, political correctness and access to information improves. Then this something's ability to function and exist may have seriously diminished. Please do not think it has gone away. It will adapt and survive. It always has. Is it evil? Is it good? A difficult question. And there are many answers, depending on your perspective and interaction with its force. Fortunately, most will never have to ask or even know the question. Most things bad in this world, along with many things good for the last few centuries, have come from Great Britain. A nation which spawned many great minds and pushed all the frontiers has always known how to survive and prosper. The driving forces buried in the depths of the once great nation were responsible for many atrocities to preserve their grip on power. The American Indians weren't the first to take scalps, it was the British. The long hair and braids of the natives made interesting trophies. The Nazis didn't invent concentration camps. The British did. They used them in the Boer War 50 years earlier. Firebombing allies, misinformation and dirty tricks are almost a national pastime. The British practically invented espionage, and they have most certainly perfected it to a fine art. Through the 50s, 60s and 70s, Britain's secretive operatives developed the ability to listen to a Soviet agent whisper in his lover's ear at 1,000 yards, in a sandstorm. The amount of money, time and resources the British dedicated to eavesdropping on anyone of interest in recent decades is staggering. So when you, the British public, all freely volunteered to carry around a personal transmitter and now even a video camera, they were highly delighted. While other nations built weapons, Britain built the ability to watch, listen and know. London has more cameras than any other city in the world. You, the British people, are the most carefully observed population on the planet. Why, when you are told for the last 20 years the tabloid newspapers have been listening to your telephones, recording and stalking at leisure, didn't any of you take a look at the device which you take everywhere and think you might like some privacy occasionally? No, of course you didn't. If the newspapers can do it, then who else can, if they wanted to? The illegal recreational drugs market is estimated to compete globally in financial value with oil and weapons. Combined spending on illegal drugs in the UK is measured in the hundreds of millions annually. Illegal drugs are a cash business, untaxed and unregulated, and of no financial benefit to Britain. It is a steady flow of money out of the nation's legitimate fiscal system directly to organised crime, both at home and abroad. Drugs are intrinsically linked to or directly responsible for murder, robbery and numerous other criminal activities which undermine law and social order. It would be naive to think a force within the bowels of a Britain who had listened to the Soviets and the many Reds under the bed and practically invented espionage and deception would sit idly on its hands while all this happened in its own backyard. The nature of the beast is and always has been the same. They know now and will always know what you are doing, if it concerns their financial and national security. Note the order of preference. They have the technology, they have the resources, and it's in their nature to spy, to manipulate and manage anything in their own backyard to suit their own agenda. Do not think anyone amongst them will ever break ranks and divulge what they are capable of. If you knew what they know, then you would know that the moon would not be far enough to escape their wrath. No one will ever leave their club. The Essex boys were but a minor irritation in their grand scheme, and in the end served a purpose. Now I'm sure a number of dangerous and wealthy men, who thought they might step back and enjoy the fabled good life, now find their worlds collapsing around them as they no longer serve a greater purpose. Have you ever thought your phone battery suddenly went flat? Did you ever go to make a call and hear the background noise from the room you were standing in through your phone's earpiece? Think of all the strange things the little devices you carry with you everywhere have done. They can turn it on remotely. It will listen to all it can while you think it's sleeping. They can access the camera, watch live feed from the inbuilt optical lens. It tells them where you are. It lets them know who else is with you. It is the worst thing that ever happened to you, if you have something to hide. And the best thing that ever happened for them, if they are interested in you. They'll never let you know just how good it is. It's the best thing they've had since they stole the Enigma machine from the Germans. Never forget how many men they let go to their graves to protect that secret. Should the listener to this video want to get straight to the Essex bank robberies and drug action, then this video can be skipped. However, this book is written from the perspective of the British establishment and its manipulation of events, leading to the murder of three of Essex's most notorious and violent drug barons. To understand what was waiting for the Essex boys, and who they would really come up against, one must first read a little of the type of man who the British establishment could employ in its efforts to control them. An introduction to the calibre and efficiency of the men whom the more secretive elements of the nation's enforcers may call on to operate at the front end. To briefly touch on the Falklands conflict is an extremely poignant reminder as to just where the establishment's real boundaries lie, or rather, where they don't. The Falklands Islands, May 1982. Sergeant Angus Peacock, 22 SASD Squadron Mountain Troop, and Corporal Bill Handley worked their way along the length of the central isthmus of East Falkland. It had taken 3 days, or rather 3 nights. The lack of good cover meant they'd remained motionless during daylight hours, moving only under the cover of night. The sun rose late at around 8:30 a.m. and set again early by 5 p.m. The faint sliver of the evening crescent moon was gone a couple of hours after sunset. The pair decided on the laying up position, a good hour before dawn's greyness emerged on the break of each new day. They didn't move off again until the full darkness of the night enveloped them. Movement had been slow, cautious and laborious. The 2 SAS men could hear the light-hearted banter of the Argentinian troops only a few hundred yards away. They belly-crawled steadily with their equipment towards their objectives, slowly freezing in the cold and remote South Atlantic islands' empty blackness. Sergeant Angus Peacock, a career soldier, had already been ashore in the Falklands for over 2 weeks. He had been attached to the mountain troop since joining 22 SAS from 2 Para. Angus had entered the parachute regiment straight after leaving school. Corporal Handley came to the regiment from the Marines. He started SAS life in the boat troop. But Bill, or Buffalo to his mates, developed an affinity for the rugged mountain terrain where Angus operated. Bill was a good long-range shooter. The land was a better firing platform than a small rib, so he'd found his calling in life, the mountains. Bill came ashore with the beach landings on the night of the 21st of May at San Carlos. Bill carried with him a fully loaded Bergen. It contained all he would need to survive in the harsh Falklands conditions for at least a month. He also carried one of the new satellite phones. The battery was fully charged, or so they told him. Bill carried the regular complement of grenades, sidearm and his knife. The long gun of choice was an Accuracy International L42A1 sniper rifle. In the last 6 months alone, he had sent 5,000 rounds down the new hammer-forged heavy 7.62 NATO barrel. This had replaced the gun's original. It had a 4-groove, right-hand twist rifling in the replacement barrel and made for more consistent accuracy. Bill had fitted the East German-made Pekka Berlin telescopic sight himself. Bill could hit a small coin consistently at 1,000 yards with the weapon. He had 10 full magazines in his webbing pouches and carried another 100 rounds in the Bergen pack on his back. The rule for a sniper was 1 shot, 1 kill. So Bill was being optimistic with the amount of ammo he carried. If he needed them all in the next few days, then he'd likely as not win the war single-handed. The guys from 40 Commando had jibed him as he'd loaded the magazines and cleaned the rifle for the second time on board HMS Fearless on the evening of the 21st of May. Bill wasn't the first onto the beach. Nothing much went on anyway. A few startled sheep were about the worst of it. The Argentines later started bombing the troops with their Canberra bombers. By then, Bill and Angus had long since moved away from the beachheads. Angus found Bill in the small hours of the morning of the landing, hanging around the command post of 40 Commando as agreed previously. The 2 SAS troopers set off on what Angus called a gentle tap, and Bill referred to in the tradition of the Marines as a short yomp. The two covered most of the 13 miles to their objective before dawn. From their first layup position, they saw the first of the Argentinian positions at Burnside Hill. The morning brought with it heavy mist, so they heard more than they saw. If they'd come too close during the night, they might be seen once the mist burned off. Unfortunately, the weather never cleared all day. The pair were cold, wet, and extremely uncomfortable. They withdrew west a couple of hours after the darkness of night enveloped them, then called in the situation report as ordered on the sat phone. Not a lot of change from earlier reports by other SAS reconnaissance patrols. After a cold ready meal, they headed south over the rough barren terrain before they again crawled east to another layup position to have a look at the Argentine positions at Darwin in the coming daylight. The RGs were in bigger numbers here, well dug in on the ridge. The Argentinian troops had also dug 2 well-placed machine gun pits. Their arcs of fire would be a problem for the approaching paratroopers due in a few days' time. The pair repeated the process again after dark, again withdrawing west, making a sit rep on the satellite phone, then heading south once more under cover of night. The next 2 days were spent reconnoitring Goose Green and the airfield. The pair of SAS men had spent 3 cold nights on the isthmus and were suffering from the continual damp and freezing conditions. No hot food was possible, not even a hot brew-up. They were too close. The ground's topography was always difficult to gauge in the extreme darkness of the nights. Each morning they felt open and exposed, as the grey dawn's light revealed the barren landscape. Any sniff, trace or sound of them, and it would be too easy for a determined Argentinian patrol to thoroughly search the barren land. If they were flushed out of hiding, they would have a very little chance of escape or evasion. Their field of operation was just too restricted on the narrow isthmus. They wouldn't be able to hold off a determined attack in numbers by the regular Argentinian soldiers. After a token blast of their weapons, it would probably be an embarrassing surrender. The British Paras were due to attack Argentinian positions in the early hours of the morning of the 28th, the ultimate objective being the airfield, so they had to remain undetected until then at the very least. The night of the 26th for the cold and wet SAS men was a slow creep back to northwest of Darwin Ridge. The guns defending the airfield would need fast air to deal with them. Their recommendation, along with the accurate map reference locations for the cannons. RAF Harriers were the only viable option, was the last message sent by Angus using the sat phone. Angus wasn't sure it was received. The extreme cold and damp had done for the technology on the night of the 26th completely. No more contact with operational command. The SAS were to be on a station of their choosing, according to their standing orders, to provide sniper cover where it would be most effective for the coming assault by the Paras. The Paras would be briefed. Friendly sniper cover could be operating, and to think before they engaged friendly covering fire for an obvious overwatch on their flank. They hadn't altogether made the 2 SAS men overconfident about where to place themselves in the coming firefight. The 2 35mm Oerlikon anti-aircraft cannons at the small airfield were not something a single sniper could realistically engage. The machine guns on Darwin Ridge would cause casualties from an advancing ground force. The removal of at least one of the weapons would support a flanking move by the British Paras. Sergeant Peacock decided it was better to help their Paras at the ridge. The day of the 27th passed slowly. The pair had stayed further west than they had on the run south a couple of days earlier. The Royal Navy bombardment to soften up the Argentines before the land assault was due at 3 a.m. on the 28th. British Navy gunnery is not an exact science. The thought of going forward the following night was on both their minds, though not their tongues. By 2 a.m, the cold and wet elite Special Forces soldiers were northeast of Darwin Ridge. Bill reckoned he'd identified a reasonable shooting position 200 yards in front of where they currently lay. The terrain was not on their side. Any further back from the action and they were on the back of another rise, which didn't afford a view of the Argentine soldiers' positions on the Darwin Ridge. Bill would be firing about 300 yards across a shallow depression. Cover was sparse on the wind-torn barren South Atlantic outposts of the dwindling British Empire. Ideally, Bill should have been 800 yards out. They were both experts in concealment, but once Bill started shooting, they would be damn exposed. The position he eventually chose should have an easy shot at one of the machine gun pits, and possibly both of them. They were currently 500 yards out and planned to belly crawl in when the naval bombardment started, assuming that ordnance was landing on the other guys and not on the dead ground they were heading for. Most of the approach would be out of the line of sight of the Argentinians on the ridge. Technically, it would have been better to get into position before the bombardment, but at only 300 yards out, neither had thought to suggest it. The Navy were late getting started. The guys were eventually in position just after 4:30, and the shelling continued for another 30 minutes. Fortunately, no friendly ordnance fell on them. The sound of a running ground skirmish could then be heard to the northeast as the naval bombardment subsided and finally fell silent. The Argentinians on the Darwin Ridge had just kept their heads down. They'd had nothing to shoot at so far. Bill had a good bead on the nearest machine gun. The furthest gun pit wasn't so easy, but he could probably cause them some difficulties. The sporadic gunfire to the north continued in the darkness. Still no sign of the Paras, and the grey light of dawn was breaking. The two SAS men watched the ridge, still nothing to do. The first action they saw was a small number of Argentine troops withdrawing to the ridge from the northeast. The Argentines were fighting a reasonably well-organised rearguard action as they came from the direction of Coronation Ridge. The Paras emerged out of the mist. Unfortunately, they were quickly pinned down at the base of Darwin Ridge. There was precious little cover for them to advance on the positions held by the Argentines. The British boys were getting reasonable mortar cover coming in from their fire teams somewhere behind them. The trouble was, the RGs were well dug in and had their own mortars doing a good job of spoiling the advance and keeping the British boys' heads down. From the layup position, the SAS watched the Paras send a small force forward into the gully to attack the ridge. Angus wanted to scream, "No!" The first few guys in never stood a chance. They were cut down by the withering Argentine machine gun fire. Bill dropped the nearest Argentine gunner with a headshot. Before his number two in the pit had realised what had happened, Bill dropped him. It gave the exposed Paras a chance to fall back to cover. Bill put 2 rounds from his bolt-action sniper's rifle into the second machine gun pit. He didn't know if they counted. The machine gun was silent briefly, then resumed again. The first machine gun opened up again, but this time it raked the ground in front of the 2 SAS guys. It wasn't right on target, but mud and gravel kicked up in front of Bill and Angus. The gun's new operators had an idea where they were. Bill could see through the scope. 2 more Argentinian soldiers had made it to the first pit. They were keeping their heads low and pointing the heavy machine gun just off to his left and lower down the slope at a small outcrop of rocks. The replacement gunner didn't know exactly where their hide was and was looking for obvious cover a sniper might use. Bill had deliberately avoided such a location. The British Paras now had bodies out there on the ground, dead or dying. The Argentinian machine gunners raked them again and again. The SAS men watched again, almost in disbelief at the stupidity or extreme reckless courage of the Paras. They were going forward again, into the same gully of death. The Paras died in the open scrub again. Bill had no choice. He took out the nearest machine gun team a second time. He then dropped the last 4 rounds from the magazine into the second machine gun pit. The gun went silent. But he couldn't tell if they were kill shots. No clear line of sight, even with the rifle's powerful Pekka scope. It was mid-morning and the Paras were tied down. They needed luck or fast air to clear the ridge, or they would be in danger of having to withdraw. Not good for the 2 SAS guys, who had now announced their presence in the deadly game of death. The rake of machine gun fire tore up the ground all around them. Again, new arrivals had made it to the machine gun pit. They were coming along a narrow trench from their well-dug-in positions above the ridge. The replacement Argentinian gunners, coming from the main elevated positions they held, now had an even better idea of the SAS sniper location. Angus was spotting for Bill. He had just seen the brave and lone para trying to make his way up to the ridge. The lone British paratrooper was using the narrow gully to shield himself from the nearer machine gun pit. Angus lost sight of him every few yards as the soldier struggled to remain in cover and alive. Angus gently nudged Bill and pointed slowly so as not to create any sign of movement in the hide, which would be seen by the machine gun crew still desperately scanning the hillside for them. The regular rifle fire from the ridge was keeping all but this one brave paratrooper pinned down. Through his sniper rifle's powerful scope, Bill watched a lone para moving slowly up. The lone paratrooper carried an M72 66mm tube on his back. He was definitely stalking the nearest machine gun position. The weapon, if he was on target, would destroy not just the operators but the weapon, its pit and any nearby ammunition. All Bill could hope for was that the Argentines ran out of guys willing to go forward and man the machine gun before they found his hide and decimated it. The 66 would put a finite end to the emplacement, leaving the paras clear to flank the ridge very quickly. Especially if Bill could spoil the furthest machine gun's operations long enough. The further machine gun post had seen the danger, so they raked the gully again and again. The para hunkered down, but he was heavily exposed to the furthest pit's machine gun. The brave para wouldn't make it, and get a clear shot at the pit he was stalking. The arc of fire had been well planned by the Argentines when they placed the two weapons. Bill looked at Angus, who nodded. Bill had already changed his rifle's magazine. He laid two more full magazines out in front of himself. Then he started to drop round after round into the second machine gun pit. The machine gun fell silent. The ground around them exploded as the nearer weapon and Argentines on the ridge zeroed in on them. Through the melee of mud and peat which sprayed up around him, Bill kept the bolt-action rifle on target and went through two magazines, then the third was almost done. The crazy paratrooper was stood up tall. He'd made the ridge, and he had the tube on his shoulder. The brave para never wavered his aim. Exposed as he was, he shot, ran straight and true. The searing white heat radiated from the explosion of the anti-tank rocket. It had gone directly into the machine gun pit. The battlefield held its breath for an instant. Then the paras pushed hard. They came on fast, out of the arc of fire from the remaining machine gun. Bill pulled out more magazines from his webbing and looked for any opportunities on the ridge. The white flag soon appeared all along the Darwin Ridge. The Argentines had repelled the British paratroop regiment for several hours, but determination and extreme valour won the day. Bill laid a rifle on its side. It was covered in the blood and brains which had once been Angus's head. A firefight is a lottery. Some live and some die. It all comes down to fractions of an inch. The nearer Argentine machine gun, before it was forever silenced, had found the hide. The bullets had ripped the ground all around them. Angus, lying next to Bill, caught several of the high-velocity rounds. The last exchange between the two men had been a silent acknowledgement of the risk involved if Bill fired. He had to fire. Bill stayed with Angus for the rest of the day and through the following night. The show was all over the next morning, and the airfield had the Union flag flying all over it. What he hadn't realised, not all the blood on him belonged to Angus. The firing position Bill used had his head lower than his torso. They had been laying on the downside of a slope, feet higher than their heads and shoulders. Bill's standard firing position using the bipod, legs apart, rifle butt in tight to the shoulder, the custom-made cheek piece nestled under his sighting eye, the right eye, and a bullet from the machine gun had grazed through his left buttock cheek and disappeared into the hillside between his legs. Bill now had a neat 3-inch slice through his lily-white arse. The bullet had opened up his camouflage drills and his flesh. The freezing conditions and dealing with Angus had meant his mind hadn't recognised or registered the pain initially. Bill dug into his Bergen, sorted out the curved needle. He washed his wound, sprinkled the antibiotic powder into it which hurt the most, and then put several crude stitches in. Stitching up your own arse wasn't the easiest thing to do. The cold is the greatest of anaesthetics, but it made his fingers numb and the knots were a mess. More antiseptic and several butterfly plasters added to the mess. Followed by a field dressing, and the bleeding had slowed to nothing more than a slight ooze. He wouldn't bleed out this time. Bill just didn't fancy letting the paras near his bum, so it would have to do until he got to a real doctor. By mid-morning on the 29th of May, it was all over. The place was buzzing with paras, vehicles, helicopters and Argentine prisoners. A British officer eventually approached a hide on the hillside cautiously, with a burly sergeant and 2 grunts. The grunts looked twitchy. Bill remained still, not wishing to alarm them. 20 yards out, the sergeant had seen enough of Bill's kit to know what he was approaching. He relaxed noticeably. So did everyone else. "Regiment?" the sergeant asked. "D Squadron," Bill replied. "That was one hell of a job you did on those machine gun emplacements, young man. Is there anything we can do for your colleague?" "Captain John Barclay Smith, 2 Para, D Company." The officer gave the salute in response to the weak efforts Bill made, still laying on his side. Sitting was not a comfortable option right now. "No, it was pretty quick, so guess he didn't suffer. I could do with some help to get him down. I got a small flesh room myself and a hot brew would be most welcome, and a battery for the sat phone when someone can. I guess my guys will have another job for me soon enough." "Sergeant, can you get this man what he needs and look after his friend, please?" As with most army officers' polite requests, it was in fact an order. "Of course, sir. What's your name, lad, if you can tell me?" A genuine question from the sergeant. "Corporal William Handley, but the boys call me Buffalo on the account of the long gun." "Buffalo Bill. Well, thank you once again. That was some bloody drubbing those machine gunners gave you two. Surprised you were able to keep their heads down long enough for our boy with a 6.6 to finish it. But we owe you. Thanks." "We lost a colonel in the gully at the foot of the bridge." Captain Barclay Smith leaned down and shook Bill's hand, then made his way slowly back down the slope, leaving the sergeant and the 2 grunts to sort Bill's shit out. Bill left the Special Air Service and the whole army thing 4 years later, age 33. The regiment looked after its own. No medal for Bill. He vanished off the isthmus as quietly as he had arrived. Angus Peacock stayed on East Falkland. It was the way of things. A bronze plaque bears his name on a lonely memorial. 6,000 miles from home, never to return, always 36 years, young. Bill could have stayed in the regiment, but he no longer had the appetite for the front end of the job. The training, the endless training was fine. He knew if he stayed, eventually he'd be in another hide, it would all be the same again, or worse. The Metropolitan Police Force was a far cry from the British Special Forces, but a uniform is a uniform, and when you get used to one, it's hard to do anything else. Well, that was Bill's excuse. Police Constable Handley ate the humble pie, like any good squad he could, went through Hendon and came out of a sparkly uniform. Rumour had it they might soon get tasers and CS gas, deadly stuff. The Kevlar stab vest and the utility belt was a distant cry from the kit he had handled in the other life. The other life became just that. No book deals for Bill. He wasn't that guy. He put the regiment out of his head and never looked back. He did a good job of it. The easy short story about being a corporal in the Royal Marines came naturally. Bill edited out the Falklands experience, if he was ever asked about his military career, which was rare, as he'd not told anyone anything exciting about it, ever. Bill attended a couple of the regiment's social events the first few years he was out. He didn't tell the boys about the life of a policeman. It wasn't the sort of thing to bring up. All a bit too mundane and normal. Several of the guys had gone on to private security. Some talked hush-hush nonsense about being soldiers of fortune, mercenaries for hire. Some was true. A lot was bullshit. The regiment generated men who would never fit into civilian life, never able to adjust to the average guy on the streets version of normal. The ex-servicemen of the Special Forces Regiment would always be different, having seen things they wouldn't, shouldn't, and generally couldn't discuss outside of their circle. Bill had done reasonably well in moving away from it all. He'd just been able to put it away in a box somewhere in his memory. The less he opened the box, the easier it became. Bill's military file was exemplary, and large parts of the later years either closed or heavily redacted. What he had done in his final year was an amount of close-quarter protection for senior politicians and even a bit for the royal family. So while his armed forces career was hard to access, anywhere beyond the good marine and exemplary conduct, there was a file on him available to others at Special Branch. Special Branch knew he'd joined the bottom ranks of the Metropolitan Police. They always knew things like that. Initially, the department his application had come across was unsure as to whether he would be suitable. The officer carefully read Bill's application. It was completed accurately and honestly. The trouble was, the man was a professional killing machine and extremely capable. Someone should have a quiet word. The guy should be invited to look elsewhere for employment, was the recommendation penned. The recommendation went to a more senior officer for signing off. It was ultimately denying an honest man who had risked all for Queen and country of a decent career opportunity. Fortunately for Bill, the more senior officer took a more pragmatic view regarding Bill's particular skill set. Bill's file would be kept at Special Branch. Constable Bill Handley wouldn't know that. Margaret Thatcher had romped back to power after the Falklands, the Iron Lady of politics. Maggie now had Northern Ireland firmly in her sights. The senior Special Branch officer was aware she had slipped the leash off her dogs. To have a man with William Handley's training and ability sat quietly in the ranks of the Metropolitan Police couldn't be a bad thing. Who knew when his particular skills might be required? Bill now had a guardian angel, or maybe just a monkey on his back, depending on how, or even if, things developed in the future. That man, or monkey, was seated on high in the very upper echelons of the United Kingdom's police force. A place where things could become very grey and the boundaries were often stretched. Bill was okay with the uniform bit of the job. He was a fit guy and reliable, the steady type of bloke. Early on, the CID team pulled him in on a few operations. He did a bit of surveillance on a few occasions, and he did it very well. Police Constable Handley soon got a reputation for his ability to operate on his own initiative. SAS soldiers are far from stupid gunslinging muscled morons. They are resourceful and outwardly very normal-looking individuals. Bill had a calm and inner strength about him. He took the sergeant's exam at the end of 1990, having moved officially to the CID 2 years previously. He enjoyed working with the team at Ilford in East London, where he was posted after making it to plain clothes. They'd had some good results, and he had friends. And then Bill eventually hooked up with a pretty lady called Linda. Linda was divorced with a couple of kids. She lived in Upminster. In the regiment days, there had been girls, but his head was in a different place back then. Now, life was on a different plane. He even liked Linda's kids. The other life was really a thing of the past, long forgotten. The subsequent move to Romford was a change, but not an unpleasant one. Bill was practically living with Linda by now, and Romford was nearer to Upminster than Ilford. The flat in Ilford could go up for rent soon. He would still see the Ilford boys for the weekly curry in Cranbrook Road. The boys now had a dragon boat rowing team, and he'd got into that in a big way. Romford Police Station was on the main road, next to the Magistrates' Court and a short walk from the busy marketplace. Romford had its fair share of villainy to keep Bill both busy, interested, and sometimes frustrated. The average lot of a hard-working copper in the home counties. The locals fancied themselves as being of a better class than the residents in Ilford, but knew they weren't as posh as the lot up the road in Brentwood. It appeared things got better as you went along the A12, and worse if you took the A127. Basildon was about level with Ilford in the poshness stakes. All this seemed particularly important to the average Essex boy, but meant bugger all to an ex-marine from Cornwall. Bill would get very acquainted with the Essex boy mentality in the coming years. His file at Special Branch was still there, yet there had been little interference in the 6 years prior to the Romford posting. Bill got what he applied for approved. He passed the exams on his own merit. The file, his file, had nothing untoward in it, and got the odd little extra gloss to keep him happy, without his knowledge. Bill was realistic about his career prospects. He wanted to carry on up the promotional ladder, and enjoyed the work. The only problem for Bill, and the only drawback, is that he liked to get out and amongst it. He was a hands-on copper. As a detective sergeant, it was a good combination. To move up to DI, he would have to become more corporate. It all started to get a bit political, and that level and upwards. The guardian angel knew Bill wasn't heading too far up the rankings ladder. The monkey on Bill's back liked it this way. If Bill's skill set was needed one day, he would be a lot easier to manipulate as a foot soldier rather than a career junkie. Bill was a team player. The honourable fair play guys don't stand a chance with the politicians in this world. Another Monday morning CID briefing at Romford. They had some special guests this Monday morning from Serious Crime. Everyone had been told about it over the weekend. He who needed to be there was there, including Detective Sergeant Handley. The Serious Crime guys took their chairs in the CID briefing room, a tight bunch, just 3 of them, and sticking together, almost an air of arrogance, especially amongst the 2 insubordinates. They were headed up by a guy who had mentioned he lived in Basildon. He was part of a Metropolitan Police task force to deal with serious organised crime. He was there because something was maybe going to happen on their patch. The Romford team formed a tight unit themselves. Empty chairs separated them from the visitors. The murmur was they were from Special Branch, but it wasn't confirmed by the visitors.